Any tour of the town should start here, a story of success. Robert W. Service, Bard of the Yukon, the world's most commercially successful poet, the shooting of Dan McGrew, the single best-selling poem of all time. And it's here that he may have learned his trade, for there are no fewer than 34 pages in his autobiography of his childhood in the Langray Tune, as he calls it. Born at Preston in 1874, his father had belonged to a long-standing Kilwinning family. He, the father, had tried to set up in business but had fallen in hard times, and young Robert, at the age of about 5, had been sent to be brought up by his grandparents here, where John Service, the grandfather, was postmaster. He attended church and the parish school and must have been taught well, for it was here that he composed his first poem. Asking if he could say grace at his 6th birthday, he came away with a glimpse of the genius to come. God bless the cakes and bless the jam, bless the cheese and the cold boiled ham, bless the scones Aunt Jeannie makes, and save us all from belly aches. Amen. The memorial was set up by the poet himself on a nostalgic return in 1930, but there is no mention of his parents. He did come to revere his beloved Papa, but did he bear resentment at being shunned at an early age? A human interest story, maybe. Nearby is the James Blair Table tombstone, clockmaker, died 1850, who installed the clock in the tower. And apart from being driven by electricity rather than falling weights, all the complex brass mechanism of 1816 is still there. One of his sayings was that a four-sided clock was like a politician. When the time was quarter to the hour or quarter past, the time was right on each face, but the minute hands were pointing in all 4 compass directions. A Burns connection. Memorial to James Stephens, minister here from 1803 until his death in 1824. But much earlier, when he was a young assistant, he had preached a sermon at Mauchline and used it as text, "And they shall go forth and grow up as calves in the stall." Burns seemingly heard of this and penned his famous satirical poem The Calf, where he featured the nervous young man. "Right, sir, your text I'll prove it true, though heretics may laugh. For instance, there's yourself just now, God knows, an uncooked calf." The minister had a long and successful life. He spent time in England, where he founded the London Missionary Society, and he became the Reverend Dr. Stephens. But he never shook off the unkind lampooning of him by the National Bard. On the reverse, the elaborate monument to another long-standing Kilwinning family, the Crawfords. Quentin Crawford, writer, 1743-1819, was a notable figure on the European stage of his time, much involved in the intrigue of the French Revolution. Major General Robert Crawford, killed 24th of June 1812 as he led the storming of Ciudad Rodrigo. Black Bob Crawford to his men, who buried him in the breach they'd made, was one of Wellington's most able lieutenants of the Peninsular War. Some of his exploits are featured in the TV series Sharp with Sean Bean. The David Muir Memorial Wall Tablet, original within the church. David Muir, 1666-1741, an early entrepreneur, but his dealings did not seem to everyone to be above board, and maybe to make up for this, his will revealed that he had left to the Kirk Session of Kilwinning the farm and lands of Woodgreen and their incomes on behalf of the poor. The Woodgreen Mortification Trust is now administered by the North Ayrshire Council. It was David Muir who in 1724 donated as a prize to the Ancient Society of Kilwinning Archers the silver arrow, now the centrepiece of the magnificent Archer's Trophy. Parish Church, record of baptism from 1669, marriages from 1678, priceless communion silver from 1677. Rebuilt 1774 on the site of the chancel and crossing of the 12th century abbey. itself on the site of an early Christian monastery. A fragment of a once magnificent Celtic high cross from those early days is at present in the North Ayrshire Heritage Centre in Saltcoats. There's evidence of a crypt sealed off in ancient times. Burials recorded at the Abbey include that of Bernard de Linton, believed to have drawn up the famous Declaration of Arbroath in 1320, and Hugh of Eglinton, likely author of the epic 14th century poem Gavin and the Green Knight. On the north side of the church is the Eglinton aisle, with prominent loft within, with drawing room behind, an outside stair for entry and leaving. Above the stair is a carved panel dated 1593 with the initials RME, possibly for Robert, Master of Eglinton, and J.C., maybe for Jean Campbell of Loudon. The arms of the Montgomerys and the Campbells, and the mottos Garde Bien and I Bide My Time. But the important thing here is the social history. The 17th century was the time when Presbyterianism, with its open way of doing things, gained the upper hand. But in 1712, the new and now United Kingdom government made a move that was to have dire consequences. The Patronage Act restored the right of lay patrons, usually the principal landowner of the parish, to appoint the parish minister, and was to be the cause of much heartache and division. Most outspoken against it was the Reverend Ebenezer Erskine, minister of the Westport and Stirling, and for his pains he and 3 others were deposed. Later, in 1743, the Gang of Four seceded completely to become what was known as the original Secession Church. But at first it must have seemed a storm in a teacup, and the Earls of Eglinton continued to sit above the parishioners here in the laird's loft of their special aisle. But word of these new ideas of a democratic church, as it might be seen today, must have spread, and would flourish in another unique and remarkable Kilwinning story to be featured later. Other features of the Abbey Church, now to be called Kilwinning Old Parish Church, are the organ, built by Foster and Anderson of Hull, first played in 1897 and highly regarded. The 800th anniversary window of 1988 with images of monastic life, and the Cole Hamilton memorial screen of 1990 displaying healing plants used by the monks. Earlier stained glass includes a fine example installed in 1951 by Gordon Webster, one of the outstanding glass artists of that time. A particularly personal and poignant item is the window presented in 1912 by Mr. Gilbert Stewart of Claremont in memory of his son Alex, who died aged 10 years, where the boy's face can be seen within a halo. Transatlantic connections are many. On 1st of May 1888, Princess Bright Eyes of the Omaha spoke here on the plight of the Native Americans, and a century later, in 1989, the Abbey Church twinned with the First Presbyterian Church of Marietta of the Cherokee Presbytery, Georgia, USA. Since then, there have been pulpit exchanges and visits both ways. An example of how the community here pulls together is the 800th anniversary tapestry in a prominent position within the building, a part contributed by each of the primary schools in the town. Passing through the Abbey grounds, where the surviving south transept gable is an iconic image of the town. Some of the last rights of the Abbey were sold in 1616 to Alexander Hamilton of Grange, whose descendant, also named Alexander, was to be one of the greatest engines of the American Revolution. Through the east processional doorway to the Abbey Church Hall. Parish Church Hall, built 1912, and occupied by the military during World War I. During World War II, the hall was again involved, this time with the commandos. Although the training areas were in the north, Kilwinning, it seems, was one of the main billeting stations, with men from the Royal Regiment of Wales and the South Wales Borderers looked after in homes here and welcomed as part of the family, many later settling in the town. Rolls of honour from earlier, one beautifully designed for Fergus Hill Church, can be seen in the Heritage Centre. Looking across from the Abbey ruins to Greenfoot Church, the original Secession Church in Kilwinning. Opposition to the system of patronage simmered, but it was an event in a neighbouring parish that was to begin a new chapter in Kilwinning's history. In Kilmores in 1740, the Reverend David Smeaton, who had been ordained by one of the deposed Secession clergymen, was able to build a church there, and in hearing of this, a number of people who were reluctantly with the parish church here broke away and formed themselves into a Secession congregation associated with Kilmores. Eventually in 1759 they were able to put up their own church here, a large and comfortable building, even with heating. It was directly across from the parish church to show their defiance. The first minister was William Jimison, died 1792, and he and his successor Robert Smith, died 1823, are buried here alongside their table tombstones in the narrow walkway round the building. They would, like everyone else, have had right of burial in the parish churchyard, but to show how defiant they were about having broken away, they chose to be here. But the seceders were split over the Burgess Oath. I hold in my heart the true religion professed within this realm and authorised by the laws thereof. Did that mean swearing to uphold the establishment that they had just broken away from, and if so, how could they do that? Those who were prepared to take the oath became the burghers, and those who would not, which was a majority here, anti-burghers. And although there was a later reunification in most places, the particularly defiant Kilwinning lot would have nothing to do with it, and remained as they were until finally disbanding about 1956. So this was one of the oldest OSC buildings, and perhaps the longest standing anti-burgher congregation of all time. Some of its records and its pewter communion ware can be seen in the Heritage Centre. Moving round the corner into Kyleswell Street at its junction with Armswall Road, and trouble again. The first free church. The issue of patronage, which had caused the secession in the 1700s, was still in the next century a cause of bitter division. In 1834, the General Assembly heard a motion by Thomas Chalmers, a professor of divinity, that there be a veto act which would give congregations the power to annul an unwanted presentation by a patron. But this was denounced by some as contrary to the law of the land. Unable to reach a compromise after years of wrangling, Chalmers in 1843 famously led about 1/3 of the ministers out of the General Assembly, a momentous event known as the Disruption. Having broken away, they would call themselves the Free Church. On 15th of June 1843, about 40 people set up a Kilwinning Free Church congregation, and 2 years later, in 1845, they were able to put up this building here. They thrived so well that in 1860 they built a much larger building, Mansfield Church, which will be seen later. In Armswall Road, there is the ring sculpture, celebrating the town's long ironworking tradition, installed in 1990 by David Anand, one of Scotland's foremost sculptors in metal. An ironworker holds up the ring on which the children play, the symbol being the young building on the foundations laid by those who had went before them. In the background there is the Eglinton Ironworks Institute, now Nethermains Community Centre. Opened in 1900 by William Baird and Company ironmasters for their employees in the massive ironworks established here in 1846. Had a large hall, meeting rooms, library and baths. Some ventures were more successful than others. At the first AGM held in 1901, the secretary made the following plea. We have met with less success with the bath than with anything else. We'd like to take a bath at least once a fortnight and try to induce our lady friends to do the same. Coming back up Armswell Road and turning into St Winning's Lane, where there is St Winning's Church, 1937, some very attractive modern stained glass. Behind, now the church hall, is the former chapel school of 1904. The chapel school was a phenomenon of its times, served as a school during the week and church at weekends. Alongside is a small prayer garden and grotto. Across is the library, where some memorabilia and the trophy of the ancient society of Kilwinning archers are on display, subject to security. Moving to the Howgate and looking up the Rye Road. Here there are the former schoolhouse of 1875 and the former Abbey Church manse of 1889, now private houses. There's also the public park of 15 acres, donated to the town by John McGavin in 1884. Wrought iron centenary gates of 1984 made by McClucky's, a local firm of ironworkers. Just within the gates is an animalatic sun clock, a human sundial indicating Greenwich Mean Time and British summertime, designed by Douglas Hunt and funded by the Rotary, again at the time of the centenary. Further on is Smithson, a retreat centre, where there's a woodland walk with contemplation stops along the way and a peace garden. The house dates from about 1800, but there are older underground structures and cellars now mostly blocked off. Visiting the house and grounds is possible, but by prior arrangement only, as vulnerable groups use the facility. Further on at Dalgarvan, there are the Townhead Cottage Row of about 1820 and a riverside walk. There's also Dalgarvan Mill, restored as a working grain mill and museum of country life and costume, antiques and cafe. Returning to the top of Dalry Road in the town, there's Cally House, Urban Development Corporation. Civic Trust Award, 1986. Built originally for the YMCA, at present shared between sheltered housing and the bridge, formerly the Cornerstone Church. On the site of the station of the Lanarkshire and Ayrshire Railway, constructed 1885-1890, and later known as the Caledonian Railway. An impressive high 7-arched viaduct survives to the north of the town, now part of the Garnock Walkway North. Further on in the Howgate, on the left, there are the former town council chambers of about 1900. The armorial window is now in the library, and some civic regalia in the Heritage Centre. The Howgate gives way to the pedestrianised town centre, and just at that point is the old post office, now the India Palace Takeaway, where a plaque, unveiled on 24 September 1976 by the poet's daughter, Mrs. Iris Davis, tells how the young Robert W. Service lived here with his grandparents. On the same theme, an emigrant from here, David Dunlop, in 1902, set up a post office in a remote part of Saskatchewan province in Canada, calling the new settlement Kilwinning. Just before the traffic-free area, there is a lane on the left leading down to Kilwinning Bowling Club, which has been in existence since the 1850s and was the first winner of the Rink Championship of Scotland, inaugurated in 1893. On the opposite side of the road, and still in Howgate, there is the Mansfield Church, now the Rainbow Nursery Complex. Built and moved to by the Free Church in 1860, the clock tower built by public subscription. The war memorial was removed in 2000 to a new building at the west end of the town. The new church, now called Mansfield Trinity, and thriving in its new location, was the first to be opened by the Church of Scotland in the new millennium. The terraced housing of about 1900 in nearby Stevenston Road have house names like Ladysmith or Tinto Hill, after battles and skirmishes of the Boer War. Returning to the town centre, within the traffic-free area, the town square. redesigned along with renewed pedestrianisation of Main Street by Irvine Bay Regeneration Company. Opened by Alex Neil, MSP, on 21 October 2010. One of the alleyways leading off has been decorated with tiles of local scenes designed by second-year pupils of Kilwinning Academy and named Castle Pen Close to an Irvine Bay project. The start, hopefully, of involving young people in the enhancement of the town. From time to time there are farmers' markets and other events in the square, including the annual crowning in June of the Segdoon Queen, Segdoon being the old name for Kilwinning, the Queen chosen from the primary schools in turn. Just beyond the square is the famous Mother Lodge Kilwinning Number Nothing, said to be the birthplace of Scottish Freemasonry. Present building foundation stone laid 17th of September 1892, completed 30 September 1893. The lodge features in the oldest known Masonic catechism, the Register House manuscript of 1696, National Archives. Minutes continuous from 20th of December 1642, though a fragment of an earlier minute book of 1599 survives, also in the National Archives. The Master's Old Jewel, given by Patrick Montgomery of Bourtry Hill in 1725, is said to be one of the oldest in existence. Small museum, open by appointment, inquiries at the Lodge or the Heritage Centre. Adjoining is the Lemon Tree, formerly the Commercial Inn. Main frontage dates from about 1820. Other parts of the building much older. Opposite a lane leads down to Erskine Church. Here, in the story of why there are so many churches in any small Scottish town, a return has to be made to 1747 and the convulsion of the Burgess Oath, which split the secession. The majority here in Kilwinning became anti-burghers. But what happened to the minority who had been prepared to take the oath? They, it seems, carried on meeting in each other's houses with no place of worship. But in 1820, on the national scene at least, the Kilwinning anti-burghers, true to form, stayed out of it. There was a reunification of the burghers and the anti-burghers to form the new national church called the United Secession Church. A minister was appointed to the new United Secession Church here in 1827, and in 1838 they were able to put up what is here, now known as Erskine Church. An attractive building with gable finials and an open bellcot, flanked by unusual architectural features known as ancones. In 1847 this church united with the Relief Church to become a United Presbyterian, the UP Church. An odd story here about one of its members a bit later is the life of John Parkinson, born here in Kilwinning in 1874. He would have been in the same class at school as a young Robert W. Service. Left school at 13 and worked in the Busby spinning mill. Taught himself mathematics and astronomy, and by 1900 was contributing to various learned publications. He then, it seems, took up the study of Islam, now topical, embraced it completely and changed his name. He impressed so much with his writings on Muslim philosophy and chivalry that he was invited out to Rangoon, coming back with membership of an imperial order and vice presidency of the British Muslim Association. Just behind and across Loughlin Way is the Congregational Church, and a story of yet another breakaway. Originally known as the Morrisonian Church after Reverend James Morrison, who in 1841 had been suspended from the United Secession Church, the movement that's just been looked at, for having what was then regarded as a heretical view not in the older Calvinist tradition. This building was put up in 1846 by those of this more enlightened view, and was soon after known as the Evangelical Union, the EU Church. In 1896 it united with another like-minded group, the Congregationalists, to become the Congregational Union. This splitting up of the churches might seem amusing, but it should be acknowledged that the churches brought all education and what would now be called social work into being and sustained them for so long. Leading down Lachlan Way to the River Bridge, Abbot Adams Bridge, widened in 1857, seems to incorporate underneath the remains of a structure probably built shortly after 1439, when Abbot Adam Spark obtained a papal indulgence for all who would, quote, give pious alms or stretch out helping hands for the building of a bridge. According to the supplication, quote, each year the faithful of both sexes are imperilled crossing the great river called the Garnock. The river was possibly much deeper and more tidal at that time. A view of the massive breastwork of stone that diverted water into the lead of the Abbey Mill and of the island formerly used as a drying and bleaching green. Here there is a rare tree planted in 1950 as a sapling from China, which was the last place where the species had survived, by Mr. Alec Grigger, superintendent of the cemetery. The bridge also starts the Garnock Walkway North and cycle path. Just above the bridge is Kilwinning Cemetery, opened in 1870, though a number of families still retained right of burial in the parish churchyard and exercised this into the early 1900s. The award-winning War Memorial, behind which is a 19th century pauper section, with a great number of interments, but of course no memorials. Also the sunken Eglinton Burial Vault, not open to the public, which in its early form had a fireplace and a form of central heating. The last interment here was Ursula, the Dowager Countess, in 1987. In contrast, there are many memorials, often put up by workmates, to poor souls who lost their lives in accidents in the mines and the Ardere explosive factory at a time when safety regulations were poor or non-existent. But perhaps the most unusual monument in a quiet corner is that of Antonio Escasio, died February 1872, 43 years faithful servant to Matthew Brown of Rio de Janeiro and Monk Castle, a large country house north of the town. The name seems Portuguese, but there is a town, San Antonio de Escazú, in Costa Rica, to which large numbers of African slaves had been taken, and so he may have been given his name from the place where he had been bought at the age of about 8 or 9. Slave, servant, whatever he was, he seemed to have become a loved member of the family. He seems to have died just a short time after his master, Matthew Brown, faithful unto death, as the gravestone says. A grand memorial to John McGavin, benefactor to the town, donating the public park, paying for Galloway's excavations and survey of the Abbey ruins in 1878, helping the ancient society of Kilwinning Archers to stay in existence, and refurbishing the U.P. Erskine Church. From a poem by Joan Kelly, the Ravenspark poorhouse poetess. O Segdon, drape thyself in gloom, let solemn silence reign, for seldom, if you ever will, mourn such a one again. But they did, and this time it was the humble parish priest, Father Cornelius Burke, from 1963 till his sudden death at the age of 50 in 1972, who had done so much for the common good. From a national newspaper at the time, if you had been in the small Ayrshire town of Kilwinning last week, you might have thought you were at the funeral of a king. There were 130 clergymen of all denominations from all over Scotland, England, Ireland and Wales. More than 8,000 people lined the pavements and marched behind the cortege through the winding street and up the hill to the cemetery. Priests, ministers, Presbyterian elders, councillors, policemen, dustmen and paper boys. They all walked side by side, all feeling the same sad loss. In the Corsell housing opposite the cemetery is the Love Memorial Hall, now Corsell Community Centre, built in 1953 as a result of a bequest by Francis Love, a native of Corsell who had done well for himself in Rochester, USA. A short distance east is the entrance to Eglinton Country Park, castle ruins, icehouse, ducat, nature reserves and woodland walks, ranger service. Colonel Richard Montgomery from the Irish side of the family was one of the most intrepid soldiers of the American cause. Montgomery County in Maryland is named after him, and the 11th and 12th Earls of Eglinton both soldiered in America. Visitors Centre, early rackets court used occasionally for exhibitions, cafe and children's play parks. Site of the famous Eglinton tournament of 1839, attended by Napoleon III. A young boy from the estate, Alexander Gamble, entered service with the French, rising to become the Emperor's Master of Horse, at his side in some of the great dramas of European history. Returning from Eglinton along Irvine Road, where, with a renewed interest in gardening, a tract of land has been given over to allotments, the Eglinton growers, through a lottery-funded application. The road returns to Bridgend, where there are some Australian connections. Born at Bridgend in 1823, very possibly in this recently restored cottage, was James Service, who emigrated to Australia, became a successful businessman and politician of national renown, finally Premier of the state of Victoria, originated the first sustained campaign for a federation of the separate states, which ultimately brought modern Australia into being. Another member of the Service family, Dr. John Service, born here about 1853, also emigrated to Australia, where he had a large medical practice in Sydney, was the author of an influential treatise on infant nursing and a trilogy of books on life in Kilwinning in the 18th century. On the southeast corner of the bridge is Bridgend Gospel Hall, built on the foundations of an ancient building, the Praetorium, where the Abbey Chamberlain Court was held. There was also what was called one privileged acre, from the bridge to the burn of Corsill. Returning over the bridge to Crossbrae, at the northeast corner of the bridge there is the David Lambie and David Savage Park, local councillors, set up in 1986, and now the start of the Garnock Walkway South, which leads past some protected wetlands and ends at Irvine Harbour, where there's the Scottish Maritime Museum. Above the bridge there is the Heritage Monument, commissioned in 2000 by Kilwinning Development Association. Originally stood in Main Street in what is now the town square. Features local scenes and historical figures. Behind in Crossbrae is the Market Cross. Much of the ancient structure has been reconstructed. The original wooden cross and a section of the octagonal shaft can be seen in the Heritage Centre. The carved faces on the Capitol, in imitation of the original medieval arrangement which has unfortunately been lost, are the work of Newtown sculptor Ian Cooper. Behind the cross are a number of listed buildings. 22 Main Street, 18th century domestic building, partly demolished in the 1940s. Rebuilt by Irvine Development Corporation, 1985, Civic Trust Award, now private flats. 24 Main Street, restored by Irvine Development Corporation. The date 1744 appears on the roof cornerstone. Other details indicate a much earlier date. Possibly the house at the cross, mentioned in the 1642 Minute Book of the Masons, and used by them occasionally as their lodge until 1780. Civic Trust Award 1986, again private house. 26 Main Street. Now the Buffs Tavern, local football team. Pediment with scroll skews at the edge of the roof. The date 1714 is within the roundel, now covered. On the opposite side of the street, the buildings here rest at the rear on the north wall of the Abbey precinct. Some are quite old, as shown by the crow step gabling and other features. Returning to the churchyard and Abbey grounds. The space across here was the site of the 18th century Mason's Lodge, the Old Lodge, as it features in a poem by George Jack, with a pend leading through. Some arches and other fragments are scattered throughout the town and will hopefully be brought together here as features of interest. Just within the gateway is the Robert Craig Memorial. Gravestone of Robert Craig, physician and surgeon, died 1883, according to the inscription, a medical practitioner in the town for 57 years. Another notable medical figure was Dr. David Gage, who campaigned against the crowded conditions, and the miners and ironworkers rose, causing the spread of infections such as diphtheria and scarlet fever. The portrait presented to him in 1928 by the town council in recognition of his 44 years' service to the town can be seen in the Institute. The Abbey Tower Heritage Centre. Tower built 1814-1816 by public subscription. Local history displays features on the abbey, the archers and masons, and matchstick models of many local buildings. Access to clock